So we've talked about God being the creator, the fact there's one God, and now we're going to talk about the fact that God is present. And again, it's almost impossible to come up with pictures to talk about these character qualities of God. So I just chose a photo from the Hubble Space Telescope, looking back at our galaxy, recognizing there are billions of planets in our galaxy, and there are billions of galaxies out there, each of which have planets, billions of planets within them. And then you begin to think of the magnitude of that space, and yet all of that has been created by God. So in the smaller picture down there is just that experience that maybe we've all had when you've gone on a hike and you finally reach a high point and you can look and you have a vista over the entire area that you've just hiked. And when we talk about God being present, the way the Psalms, the way Scripture portrays it, is very much like God has his eye on his creation, even though it is of this magnitude. Even though it's this big, God has its eye on it. And we see that in both expressions of the macro, the ultimate big, and the micro, the very fine, the very detailed. When we think about God being present, words matter. And when we explain this to kids, often what we say is God is everywhere. But the problem with that is that's a pantheistic view of God. Is God in the music stand? If God is everywhere, is God in the music stand? Is God in the concrete and the floor? Is God in the trees and the birds? And we would say, well, that reveals creation, but really, the Spirit of God is not in those things. And we got to remember, much of the Old Testament's written, especially Genesis to Deuteronomy, written to these former slaves who have come out of slavery, are confused about who their God is. They're trying to learn what makes their God distinct and unique. And so the Old Testament, over and over and over again, talks about things being in the presence of God, not so much that God is present in things. So God is not in the trees, he's not in the rocks, he's not in the fish, he's not in the birds. Okay, that's pantheism. That's Eastern mysticism. Christianity says all of this stuff is in the presence of God. We are always in his presence. And so the Psalms talk about the earth being his footstool. And the image is not that God is putting his feet on the earth and trampling it, but he is on his throne. So when it says the earth is God's footstool, the psalmist is saying all of creation, but especially earth, because that's where we live, is subject to God's authority. It's under his reign. It is part of his reign. So God, when we say that God is present, we're not saying that God is in everything. His omnipresence means that all things are in the presence of God. But one of the little pet peeves that I have as a pastor is when we say, and so God, we invite you to come and fill this place and be with us. My question is, when did he leave? And who am I to give him permission to go anywhere? Right? If God is God, and he is, then I'm always in his presence. Now, submitting to that authority is another thing. And I think that's what we're often trying to say when we make those kinds of statements. Then we invite God to come and to engage with us. What we're really saying is, God, I acknowledge you are God, and I want to submit myself to your authority. So please work in my heart. But that's vastly different than saying, God, I'm giving you permission to be here. Words matter because it changes the way we view God, his engagement with us. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, his relationship with us. In Psalm 8, Verse 1, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise, because of your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, so notice the creation theology here. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? Because we're in his presence. His love and his care are constantly directed to us. Psalm 19, just flip it forward a couple of more pages. The heavens declare the glory of God. Again, there's that creation theology, creation perspective. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Everything is in the presence of God. There is no place on earth where his creation cannot be seen, where God cannot be understood as as existing, as being there. In verse 5, the end of verse 4, in the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom going forth from his pavilion, like a champion running a race to its course. It rises from one end of the heavens and makes a circuit to the other. Nothing is hidden from its heat. And the idea is that just as it appears like the sun sets and rises, in reality we spin around, but as we see the sun rise and the sun set, and it follows that course day after day after day, so also are we in the presence of God constantly. Psalm 139, very, very clear. One of my favorite Psalms. Anytime you're feeling a little blue or wondering, God, what are you doing? This is a great Psalm to turn to for some encouragement. Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in, behind and before. You lay your hand on me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up in the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me. We are always in God's presence. So the psalmists will often use space. They talk about God being near to talk about the intimacy of the relationship, but it's primarily an emphasis on the fact that we can know this God. No other God is knowable. The whole point is that God has made creation with purpose and value. Because it's in his presence, because he hasn't abandoned it, if there was not purpose in God's creation, then right after man sinned, Adam and Eve sinned, then he would have destroyed it and started over. But there's value and purpose in it, and that's why from that moment, redemption became possible. So that follows into the fourth one, which logically that comes out of that. If God is always present, then God is always engaged. He is active. It's very easy to look around and to consider what's happening in your life, and using that as a reference point, ask the question, God, where are you? Do you care, and are you engaged? The theological answer to that is yes, but that doesn't bring a lot of comfort to a broken heart. Now, the image I've used here, a lot of people have a view of God that he's sort of random, he's capricious, he's unpredictable. And so I put the little prohibition symbol on top of the roulette wheel because what images do you use for this stuff? But God is not random. It's not a gamble with God. He has a plan. And so the picture here of a master carpenter, I love Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. We are his workmanship. And God is working to change us, to form us, to recreate us because of the influence sin has had, and we're born in a sinful world with a sinful nature. The master craftsman is recreating us. He is transforming us. Romans 12 says that we can be transformed, not just changed, not just improved, but transformed by the renewing of our minds. God is engaged with us. And this, of the four things that we've looked at, God being creator, being the only one, being present, this is the most difficult. And we can go through scenario after scenario. You understand what I'm talking about, whether it's health or relationships or finances or whatever it may be. We understand the stress that those things can cause. And the question is, God, are you engaged in this? Are you aware? Can I find comfort in you? And the answer, if we are going to engage with life, is we must be convinced. We must be convinced that, yes, God is engaged. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're always going to be able to answer and explain the why to every event. We won't. And I want to encourage you about that's okay, from the book of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, in verse 9, he says, "What does the worker gain from his toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on mankind." Okay, part of this tension is because of the nature of God's creation. And the fact that we have rebelled against God. If that had never happened, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But the reality is that stuff doesn't always work. And he doesn't say, I have seen the burden Satan has laid on man, or I have seen the burden on my sin nature. He says, God, I'm holding you directly responsible for this. He has made everything beautiful in its time, after saying there's a season for everything. He has made everything beautiful in its time. In other words, there's a time and place for everything. But I love the next line. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men. That is, he has created that God-shaped vacuum in each one of us, a God awareness that only God can fulfill. Yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Even though we're aware that there is a God, it is easier to dismiss God than to live with the mystery of God. I know there is nothing better for men than to be happy and to do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is a gift of God. If you've got a job you love, if you've got relationships you love, if you find satisfaction in hobbies or whatever it may be, that is a gift from God. That is a demonstration that God is engaged in life. I know that everything God does will endure forever. And the implication is everything we do will not. Nothing will be added to it and nothing taken away from it. And then notice his very last line. God does it so men will fear him. Why is there mystery in life? Why is there the unexplained? So that we will sensitize that God-shaped vacuum, and it will drive us to find out who is this God, and we will come to a point of acknowledging that, God, I cannot explain you. You are different than me. You are other than me. You are unique from me. So God, all I can do is acknowledge that you are God and I am not. And he says that in chapter 5, verse 2. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven. You are on earth. Let your words be few. There will always be things we don't understand. There will always be questions we can't answer. Go down a little bit further in chapter 5 and verse 7. Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore stand in awe of God. Trying to explain God is a meaningless process. Better to fear him, to stand in awe of who he is. God is engaged. And we will deal with, down the road, we will deal with the issue of where is God when I'm stressed and how to deal with that. But to understand just the character of God, we need to acknowledge and to recognize that God is engaged. And that's part of faith. We may not explain it, we may not understand the mystery behind it, but we have confidence that God is engaged.